Hello and welcome to the Shifting the Paradigm webinar series, where we build community knowledge, skills, confidence and understanding of child sexual exploitation. We hope that you find this webinar beneficial.
Thank you everybody for attending. I know everyone in this field is always quite short on time, so it is very appreciated. Before we start, I do just want to pause and acknowledge that the content that we're talking about can be quite distressing. So I just want to acknowledge self-care, and I'm going to really encourage people to get out their phones and take a photo of the number there, or even just write it down, just in case after this session it might take a bit of a toll on you as you reflect on the discussions that we've had. There will be points in this webinar where I'm describing things that are quite graphic in nature. I have considered going over those areas quite quickly, or maybe not in as much detail, and I've just concluded that if I did that, it doesn't really honour the experiences and the suffering that victim survivors have been put through. And I do significantly worry that it will just end up minimising what's happened at the benefit of those responsible. So I've made the decision to be quite clear and specific about how horrific some of these things are. And if that comes up and you decide you're not in a great headspace and need to pop out and pop back in, that's completely fine. I am presenting research which has been published. This information should always be accessible to you. So if you're not feeling in the right headspace today, I'm going to really encourage you to just prioritise yourself. You can always reach out to me afterwards if you miss things and whatnot, and I can support you to engage at a later time if that benefits. So today I'm presenting a paper that was published last year, and it certainly wasn't just by me. There was a whole team of us working on this paper, and it's been the work of the first year of my PhD. This work's been done in collaboration with the MacKillop Family Services, who are an out-of-home care provider. They're based in Victoria, Western Australia, and New South Wales, and this PhD is funded by their Power to Kids program as well. So I feel very fortunate to be a Power to Kids scholar and being able to work with this wonderful team. So we have Professor Kathy Humphries, Dr. Gemma McKibben, Dr. Jennifer Davidson are all from the University of Melbourne, and Dr. Nick Halfpenny is from MacKillop Family Services. And just to give you some context, if you're thinking, okay, we're talking about a topic, where did it all come from? And I guess what's the need behind it? I just want to quickly share what made me feel so passionate about this topic and what made us kind of come up with the idea for this paper. And it was a few years back. It was during the pandemic, and I was at the time in a position of creating some new training around child sexual abuse. And I was talking to workers that were supporting young people, and I was asking them questions like, does the current training available meet your needs? Are there any upgrades or any topics we need to include? And it wasn't long before I had workers saying to me, yeah, I've got kids on my caseload, they've got active OnlyFans accounts, and I don't know what to do about it. Or when I go to respond, I get different responses from different people as well. And at the time, I remember thinking, wow, a lot has changed since I was out working with young people. That wasn't an issue when I started, or it wasn't as prevalent as it is now. And I was really naive, and I thought, okay, I'll go do the research, I'll see what's out there and what's been published, and I'll wiggle it into this new training. And it was quite evident that there's not a lot of evidence-based practice or guidance available to workers to support young people who are being exploited in this way. And that's what was really, for me, the catalyst of this PhD. And we set off to really understand coerced, self-produced child sexual exploitation material. Now, I know that's a lot of words. If you're hearing it for the first time, you might be thinking, well, what is that? So I'm just going to pause and break it down for you how I understand it. There's a lot of definitions, such as child sexual exploitation, which doesn't have a federal agreement in Australia on what should be a national definition. So I know this is how I understand it, according and aligning with other researchers. You might have slightly different definitions, and that's okay. So how I understand coerced, self-produced child sexual exploitation material is that you have the umbrella of child sexual abuse. And under this umbrella, you can have different forms of child sexual abuse. And child sexual exploitation is one of those forms. So when people say, you know, is this incident child sexual abuse or is it child sexual exploitation? It's the same. It can be for a lot of children. Child sexual exploitation is a form of child sexual abuse. And the thing that makes it exploitation is that element of exchange. The word exchange, I can understand how it's problematic. I'm using it in the absence of a better word available. For me, I'm not trying to water exploitation down as a trade or a bad transaction for the child, but looking at exchange where the person responsible is giving the victim something, so that victim then has to be less resistant to the child sexual abuse. When we have that captured by a video, a photo, or a live stream, we then have child sexual exploitation material. There's different types of child sexual exploitation material. One of these is the coerced, self-produced child sexual exploitation material. And the reason I'm doing the quotation marks of self-produced is to acknowledge that, again, this terminology is not terminology that I think anyone's standing next to saying, this is great, we love it. We are searching for better words. Conversations we're having with children is engaging with them, seeing if they have a more preferred way on how to construct this, because I think with the term self-produced, it does imply that there is willingness or motivation on the child's behalf, or that they're leading this. To offset this, we're going to constantly use that word coerced to really make sure we're paying attention to the person responsible, and to acknowledge this isn't children, acting out or anything like that. This is people that are manipulating children, and this is the end result of that. So when I say coerced, self-produced child sexual exploitation material, I'm talking about a situation where someone is manipulating a child into providing sexual photos, videos, or live streams. So if you're hearing about this for the first time, you might be thinking, okay, how common is this? I think there are different stats floating around, and I really feel this report's quite comprehensive and maybe probably the most informative one. So the 2023 Internet Watch Foundation annual report confirmed that in that year, in 2023, there were 275,652 web pages that were reported to them containing child sexual abuse imagery. When they're saying child sexual abuse imagery, this isn't restricted to exploitation. This means that of those hundreds of thousands of web pages, the material in that would have included videos and photos of children being sexually abused. There would have been images in there that were taken without the child's knowledge. Maybe the child was asleep or unconscious, or maybe they were in an environment such as a bathroom and they didn't realize a video or camera was in there recording them. This would also include sexual abuse material that was generated by AI, either using images of a child that exists or creating a child digitally that doesn't exist and making that sexual. And it would also include the coerced, self-produced exploitation material. So they ran the numbers around what percentage of those hundreds of thousands were self-generated by children. They've used the word self-generated here. And I want you to take a guess. What amount of those images and web pages and everything that came in, how many of those do you think were coerced, self-produced by children? So if you don't know how to get into the chat, there's a little chat box that you can click into. So if you can type your guess in percentage form, that would be great. And I'm going to type in just here, hoping that it prompts. So in 2012 was when the Internet Watch Foundation started tracking this. Prior to that, I don't believe that they really had this as a category. And we've seen a rapid increase since that time. You might be thinking, Genevieve, why aren't you showing the 2024 stats? They're not out yet. So I imagine the Internet Watch Foundation is analysing that data now. and it will probably be out mid-year. So this is the most recent report that we can utilise. And so what this report found was that for the year of 2023, it was 92% of the child sexual abuse material was assessed as self-generated by children. And it's something that I often encounter when I tell people about, this is the study we're doing, this is the paper that we're bringing out. Often people will say, oh, like, what a rare topic, what a niche little phenomena that you're paying attention to. And it's such a myth that this is a rare or a niche phenomena. It has passed the point of being out of control now. And I think it left us really questioning what is going on out there, what is happening to children in our community, in our families, because just the progress of technology and the impacts of COVID, I think that this has completely gotten away from child safeguarding organisations. And so whilst I was asking myself, what is going on out there? How do you even make sense of this phenomena? We had to word that into, I guess, a more academic question. And this question changed all of the time. And I'm just going to explain the aim and methodology of this paper quite quickly. If I've done it too fast, email me and I can talk to you a bit more about it. But I'm going to assume most of the participants are excited to hear about the findings rather than methodology. So the question that we settled on was, how is the phenomena of coerced, self-produced child sexual exploitation material constructed in the literature? We absolutely considered reviewing media reports as well. However, there were a lot of problems that came with that. We have news outlets in Australia that are quoted for having internal mottos, for example, of never wrong for long. And the information we were wanting to engage in, we really wanted it to be evidence-based and peer-reviewed. So this is where our priority lay for this one. And we used critical interpretive synthesis for this one because not all of the research was victim-centered. There was a lot of problems in some of the research that we read, and we didn't want to accidentally continue that and represent that in a way that blame the child for the exploitation. So using this methodology allowed us to be critical of how children were being represented. So step one was come up with a question, and that question changed, I would say, every couple of weeks to maybe every couple of months as well. As we learned more about the phenomena, we had to tweak it every now and then. Two, we went on to the relevant databases and we searched the relevant keywords, and that resulted in us finding 1,021 papers. Myself and another researcher sat down, we developed an inclusion and exclusion criteria to make sure we were only including those that were absolutely relevant, and that resulted in us having 38 papers for the final sample. We extracted the data from each paper, and then we went through a process of coding it. So every time we saw like a little micro theme, for example, which I'm going to call a node, we pulled that out. I think we had maybe around 700 different micro themes coming out of the papers. And then through expert consultation, we started to organize these key themes. And I've said that like that was easy to do. That was really difficult to organize 700 micro themes into key themes. And as we were thinking, how do we even go about this and progress it and make sense of it? We thought about, wouldn't it be great if we had something like the Safe and Together Institute's perpetrator mapping? We had a look at that and we thought, this is so fantastic in the domestic and family violence space. Could we use it for this paper? And to kind of make sense of all of this data, could we, map perpetrator behavior? And we realized that we just simply couldn't. There were so many principles and elements in that tool, it just wasn't fit for purpose. Exploitation, we're not saying that that's a parenting choice. We're not trying to work with the person responsible and make them a safe parent. None of that's really relevant to this paper. We realized we had to kind of come up with our own theme, which we called an accountability lens, and we focused on 4 things, and that theme kind of comes through in the findings. So we really focused on methods of coercion used by the person responsible, victim impact, if the data was available to report on that, how the child was constructed and understood by researchers, and how was accountability understood. So our findings, and this probably isn't too surprising, this slide, it showed that coerced self-produced child sexual exploitation material is an umbrella term. So it encapsulates a diversity of children and young people's lived experiences of being manipulated to create child sexual exploitation material. And the following 5 forms, these were discovered in the literature review. It's not to say that they are the only ones that exist and will ever exist. We're limited to what is in the research. It's very possible that in the coming years, maybe a 6th or a 7th form will be identified as well. So at present, with the research that was already available, this is what we discovered. So the first one, we titled this the solicitation form, and I'm going to really focus on the coercion that the person responsible used, and when available, we'll look at victim impact. So perpetrators may portray themselves as younger than they are. Emphasis on may. This doesn't always happen. Requests for child sexual exploitation material were often direct to the child. Sometimes they were after extensive non-sexual conversation. So you're looking at, the typical grooming that you might see prior to the internet. Other times the request is introduced early into the conversation. I believe that Martine Powell nicknamed this the hit and run method. You might have a perpetrator message 200 children and say, send nudes, and will only pursue conversation with those that write back, for example. So it can be quite a significant variation in when that request is introduced to the child. Perpetrators may promise to keep the child sexual exploitation material private, or convince a young person that live streams are not being recorded. And there was a trend in some of the research that came up where there would be some perpetrators that would be just trying to find any victim, regardless of where they were in the world. And then there were other people that were really searching for children in their local area. It might have been because they had intentions to eventually meet up with this child face to face, but they would often go on to chat sites and whatnot to align with the school time, so outside school times for their local area, to do that as well. Often we found that the solicitation form was a starting point for other forms of this exploitation as well. The second one is the peer sexting form, and I just want to acknowledge a shift in terminology. Up until now, I've been using the word perpetrators quite a lot, and I'm going to revert back to that after this form. However, this one is talking about where children are responsible, and we're seeing an intersection with harmful sexual behaviour. I very much align myself with Simon Hackett, who's said quite consistently that children are not many perpetrators. They're not many sex offenders. They have so much capacity for change that it doesn't benefit them to title them as perpetrators as well. So when I'm talking about those responsible in this form, I'm going to use the word, those responsible. I'm going to intentionally refrain from calling children perpetrators. So the coercion that we were seeing in this form, according to the research, was that coerced sexting can involve pushy, assertive, and persistent requests for nudes, which are difficult to escape. Peers may become angry and cease communication with a young person until nudes are provided. Young people can be given false promises that the nudes will be kept private. We saw a lot of incidences of the non-consensual on-sharing of exploitation material, also known as secondary sexting. And just to be clear, no one is talking about consensual sexting in this form. So I'm not trying to present this as all sexting belongs in this. There may be many instances where you have children, say, 2 17-year-olds in a romantic relationship, and they're both sending images to each other, and we don't have that significant power imbalance in place. We're not framing that as coerced peer sexting. It's really just looking at when coercion is occurring. And I think what was quite interesting about this form is it's probably the main one where children who are victims are expected to go on day by day, spending a lot of time with the person responsible. So a lot of children suffered through coerced peer sexting and then were just expected to spend, say, 30, 35 hours a week with the person responsible, which is quite unusual when we have a look at the expectations of other victims in the other forms as well. And the impacts for these children were quite significant. As you would expect, there was significant decline in the mental health of victims. There was school avoidance, there was self-harming and suicide ideation and attempts as well. And I think there's been a fair bit of work being done around the world at the moment. This has received a lot of attention on how can these children be supported. The next one, and I think this is usually the one that surprises people the most, is the viral challenge form. So this one involves perpetrators who publish comments on children's YouTube videos, instructing them to share videos of themselves wearing revealing clothing whilst recreating viral video trends involving sexual body movements. Children may not understand there are perpetrators receiving sexual gratification from these videos. And this is the only form, I think, where children likely and genuinely have no idea that they're involved in something that is sexual. The reason that there's so much focus on YouTube is because the research, which was quite a limited body of research contributing to this form, that's what they focused on. I'm not suggesting at all this can't happen on other social media sites such as TikTok or whatnot, where children are able to upload videos of themselves and read the comments. It's quite interesting. I think you have a comment section being used as a place to commit crimes, essentially. And we also saw communication happening across perpetrators as well. So there were perpetrators that would comment on the video, say, right as the child's in a position where you might be able to see up their clothing or a private part might be getting revealed. Perpetrators will write the timestamp and then emojis such as the, what is it, like the raindrop emoji to communicate ejaculation, and they will leave that in the comments so other perpetrators can also just go straight to the video and get a screenshot in that video. It was also problematic because when this research was published, I think it's quite similar still, YouTube will make recommendations for similar videos. So if a perpetrator is going on and searching the keywords to bring up these videos, which is things like children and yoga and whatnot, yoga challenges, after they've watched that video, they'll then have a list of all other children that are kind of being manipulated into similar viral trends that have then been sexualized as well. And YouTube's really curating a list for perpetrators. And it was also quite problematic that YouTube was using banner advertisements as well. So when the video has X amount of views, advertising comes in, and there's external parties that have then again benefiting from the exploitation as well. The impacts on these children are quite unknown. The research that focused on them did so from understanding the algorithms on YouTube and keyword searches, not directly working with children. It might be that children in the moment don't understand that what they're a victim of, and it might not be till later in life they understand the significance of what was occurring. The fourth form is the sextortion form, and I expect a lot of people are familiar with this form, likely from the significant work being done by the federal police and e-safety as well. This coercion involves perpetrators who may, emphasis on may, use organised crime methods to impersonate young people when requesting and receiving sexual images, videos or live streams from vulnerable young people. Perpetrators then threaten to share the child sexual exploitation material to the victim's friends and family or harm the victim if further child sexual exploitation material is not provided. And perpetrators may demand sadistic acts be incorporated into the child sexual exploitation material. I recall when I was reading the research on the different types of sextortion that's been recorded, and there are absolutely individual offenders of this, but when people worked in organised crime ways, just the devotion and the time and the resources that went into this was so incredibly complicated and significant. It's so distressing when you hear adults say, that won't happen to my child because I've told them not to send nudes, and they think that that will be enough. Some of I guess the level of complexity that perpetrators were using was there were some groups who would design technology for the purpose of sextorting. One group in America designed this technology. I think they titled it something like Rapid Finder, and they quickly reviewed the social media pages of children who would post things in relation to self-harm or low self-esteem, and those children were picked out to be more vulnerable to sextortion as well. They would impersonate young people and encourage the person to move from a chat site into a video site. And that young person thought they were communicating, and they thought they were on video calls with other people their age, where they weren't. They were actually talking to perpetrators who were using technology to present as young people. Those people were tricked into thinking that they were in a call with a few other young people, whereas some of these groups, they charge subscription fees for other perpetrators to watch the live streaming of this sextortion as well. So you have a child who thinks, I'm talking to a few people my age, whereas really you have a whole arena of offenders from around the world watching this play out. And they spoke about, once a child decided, I don't want to be part of this, I'm out, then the threats came in. And once the threats came in for these children, some of them were made to do such sadistic things, like some had to sexually engage with their pets whilst live streaming. Others had to display harmful sexual behaviour to younger peers whilst live streaming. Some children had to self-harm and record that. They had to write derogative terms like slut on their forehead. And it's no surprise that impacts that are getting tracked for this form are just truly horrific. We have children that are ending their lives as a result of this, children that are constantly making attempts to end their lives. We have significant mental health impacts about this and within this sextortion form. And I think that this is one where children overall are usually constructed as the victim. There were some cases where a child may be referred to as a perpetrator when they were forced to engage sexually with a pet or a sibling. But they seemed a bit a while ago and kind of not as common overall. I think Australia in particular has done a fantastic job of really educating the community and schools, and now children and young people themselves around the risks of sextortion. But just to emphasize, I guess, just the web of complexity children are navigating with these perpetrators, who some had degrees in IT. They had spreadsheets for their grooming methodology and would debrief them over Discord. They were putting in a lot of hours to this every week to do it in such a seamless and manipulative way. The final form is the financial coercion form. And this looks quite brief, but it's quite complex. The reason this is so brief is because of the limited research that was available. So this coercion involves perpetrators who will give money, gifts, or other resources with a monetary value to financially coerce children and young people into providing sexual images, videos, or live streams. This financial coercion may be facilitated using websites and applications such as OnlyFans. Again, the reason I've listed OnlyFans is because that's what the research listed. There's so many different apps and websites that this is occurring on. I think that future research is going to be much better placed to have a much longer list than this. But we did find a lot of the research that reported on financial coercion was really fixated on what the child was doing. And so we kind of had to work with descriptions of what the child was doing, like selling nudes for money. And we had to kind of work backwards and go, well, what was the perpetrator doing? They were giving money. So that's why this one is quite limited. The impacts are quite limited as well around what these victims go through. And I'll talk about that a little bit more in our takeaways. So just as a summary, these are the 5 forms that we discovered. Some are already quite well known, others not so much. And at the end of this webinar, we're going to be, well, I say we, I think Hayley's going to be sending out a summary. This is kind of brought into an appendix in the paper, but if you go onto the journal and you just download the paper, it doesn't always automatically attach the appendix. You have to kind of go out of your way to see the summary of findings, which I think simplifies a lot of it. So I know that that might have been a lot. I know that when I realized there were 5 forms, I remember talking to one of my supervisors, and I felt really like a moment of clarity to be like, oh, this can happen in 5 different ways. And I remember one of them said, yeah, but so what? You know, how do you actually apply that to practice? And from a practitioner perspective, I thought, well, if I read this paper, what would I take away? What would I change about my practice? What would I pay more attention to? How should it actually influence how I support young people and work with families? So to save you some of the brain work, if your mind's just kind of having to absorb all of that really heavy information, I've just summarized some of the takeaways for me I think would be helpful if I was working with young people. So the first one, which was quite an interesting trend, was that children are often vilified or accorded undue agency when a new form of self-produced child sexual exploitation emerges. So you kind of, when society discovers it, it kind of automatically defaults into quite a victim blaming way and a frustration towards the child. And let's say this is the victim blaming frustration way. Over time, literature slowly reconstructs the child as the victim, and it kind of comes across the other way and it becomes victim centered over time. And we've seen that happen in a fair few forms, except for the financial coercion form. And I'll just give you a few examples. If I go back to this one, if we have a look at the peer sexting form, initially the early research that was reporting on this was, I feel, very angry towards victim children. There was a lot of push to have children experiencing this be viewed as a criminal, be viewed as a child sex offender who's responsible for making this material. There was push to have them registered on child sex offenders registry in the States, for example. And over time, I think we've kind of learned and reflected, and a lot of the research now is regarding the questions of how can we support this victim and how can we support the children that are responsible as well, and coming at this from a place of education as opposed to criminalisation. We saw similar things in the solicitation form and sextortion form, a lot of frustration towards the child and their perceived decision making, and slowly get corrected. The viral challenge form was amazing. They just were quite victim centered from the get-go, but unfortunately it would seem that the financial coercion form is just still stuck there in quite a victim blaming way. And so what we see is research related to the financial coercion form is often dominated by occupational lexicon. So it's often describing children as if they are adult sex workers. And I think it has such a significant and profoundly problematic impact on how we support these young people. If we're constantly describing them in the sex work industry and using terms such as they're prostituting themselves, they're selling themselves, people are buying images from them, we're not really understanding the fact that they're victims of exploitation. I do want to acknowledge and I empathise for the fact that this push to kind of view exploited children in the sex work industry goes back hundreds of years. Like, I think Louis XIV was talking about this in 1687, describing children as prostitutes. And I think it's taken hundreds of years for child safeguarding organisations to say making victimised children have the identity of paid employees is unhelpful, and it doesn't create an ideal situation for us to hold perpetrators accountable when we're viewing children in the workforce. So as I've kind of got into the grit of it, I've become a lot more intentional of the words that I use. And I always pause and think, I'm describing an exploited child. I'm not describing a child that's showing up for a 9 till 5 shift. My words need to reflect that at all times. Any occupational lexicon has to get removed when we're talking about these children and the things that they're experiencing. And I think it links on to this point as well, that perpetrators are often made invisible. And so the child can often be blamed for the exploitation. An example of what I've seen recently in conversation and in media is that the child is exploiting themselves, or the child is selling nudes. We have very passive constructions of the financial coercion. And we've kind of reached a point, I think, a lot of the time where the adult who's providing those resources, who's doing the financial coercion, isn't mentioned in our sentences at all. It's as if they don't exist. I think it's completely minimizing of what's happening. And I really think, how would we ever move forward if we refuse to acknowledge the existence of the person that's responsible in the first place? And you might have picked up on this already when I was talking about sextortion, but I think when we pause and look back at what's happening to children at the moment, we're seeing a real collapse of the online offline dichotomy. So for over a decade now, we've talked about child sexual abuse and child sexual exploitation as if it's happening in the online world or the offline world. When we hear stories of young people getting coerced through the sextortion form, for example, and they're being forced to self-harm, they're being forced to sexually engage with their pets, their younger siblings are having to display harmful sexual behaviour too. We're not looking at a virtual harm anymore. We're looking at real world impacts. They physically need assistance. Some of these children need to go to a hospital and get medical treatment because of the exploitation. And it's nearly as if once the internet's mentioned, it's online, and it's an online harm and an online risk. And I think for me, when I look at these forms, you can see a real collapse. And I would never describe, I don't think, never intentionally describe a child who's going through that as experiencing it online. I think technology facilitated captures, those words capture a lot more that this child is being hurt in the real world. And it's not just reserved to a virtual cyber part of their life. And the other one is you have to be able to spot the coercion to stop the coercion. So if things continue as they have for some of those forms, not all of them, it's not to discredit the amazing work happening in a lot of those areas, but in the areas where there are gaps, like the financial coercion, if we don't actually pause and track and map what the people responsible are doing, I don't understand how we are ever going to work together to really disrupt the perpetrator behaviour. There's so much work, I think, placed on children to self-protect, for children to just say no, like it's that simple. Whereas the reality is that there's a lot of coercion that they need assistance with. A lot of the time, children don't have an available safe exit that they can access. And I think we kind of need to be a bit more aware of that and supporting children to have a safe exit provided to them. And I think it all starts with acknowledging the coercion in the first place. And I always feel a bit odd presenting this because, it would be great if the webinars were always informative and it left you with no questions, but the reality is there's still just so much we don't know about the financial coercion form. So some of the things, I was listing them when I was waiting for the webinar to start around what are the big remaining questions, and there's probably more than this. But one, we really don't have much of an understanding around children's preferred terminology. I think this stems from not having children engaged in research on this topic enough, and them not having sufficient opportunities to kind of guide preferred terminology and teach workers how they could best be engaged with. The onset of financial coercion is still, I think, really poorly understood. And we could learn so much more about how perpetrators are really contacting these children, identifying them as vulnerable and manipulating them into the financial coercion. There's a lot that's unknown around how perpetrators evade detection for so long as well, and what methods they're utilising to do this. And also, there's still a lot of gaps in how safeguarding organisations can, I suppose, effectively disrupt this together. And they're the ones that come to mind for me. I will use this opportunity just to explain that the research project that this is focused on, it's still continuing. We've heard from professionals already. We've done a fantastic data collection with different organisations, and we're now at a point where we're hearing from children and young people who have experienced financial coercion, and that means they've been given anything of monetary value, such as safe accommodation for the night or unsafe accommodation. So drugs, transport, food, money, gift cards, gaming credits on Roblox, for example, gifts of any type. And in return, they've had to provide sexual exploitation material. We have a survey that's floating around. We have ethics approval for organisations in Australia to share that with young people, whether it be directly providing them the QR code or displaying it in their office or whatnot. And the responses we've received already from that survey have been incredibly eye-opening and really helpful, but we would still like to hear from some more victim survivors to help guide what practice could be like, to provide us advice and to really understand how we can best position ourselves to prevent, identify and disrupt the financial coercion, because there's just too many gaps in the evidence base moving forward as we're seeing an increase as well. I'll leave my contact details on that page if people have questions and they want to reach out. I think there is a fair few people attending from Queensland Child Safety, so if that's you, you can reach out to me directly through those streams, but outside that, my email's there if you do want to reach out.
Thank you for attending this webinar. Please feel free to share our resources and let us know if you have any feedback. If you would like to learn more about our program, visit projectparadigm.com.au and be sure to tune in to the next webinar.